So in previous lessons, we've managed to lift the state of whether if our checkbox is checked, and we're now able to make our checked off tasks reflect both in the text widget as well as the checkbox widget. So that's pretty neat. But at the moment, even though we have our user interface for our add task screen, it doesn't yet work. If I add something in here and I click add, well, nothing happens. And that is, of course, because in the on press of this flat button, there's actually currently no code other than a single comment. So let's go ahead and try to get this working. The first thing we have to do is we have to make our tasks more dynamic, because at the moment we're essentially just generating 3 hard-coded tasks, and they all say this is a task. Not very interesting for a to-do list app. So how can we make it a little bit more dynamic? Well, firstly, let's go ahead and make our task list into a stateful widget so that we can update its state. And what we want to be able to do is to have something that we can track and update so that we can update the state when that property changes. So we would want to create a list of task objects, and we might call this list tasks. And it's going to be set to equal a whole list of tasks, each with a property for the name of the task as well as whether if that task is completed. So let's go ahead and create a model folder in our lib. So let's go ahead and create a new package. We'll call it models. And then inside models, we're going to create a new Dart file called our task.dart. And now inside this new file, I'm going to create a brand new class, which is going to be called task singular. And this class is going to describe how every task will be. So it will have a string property, which is going to be the name of the task. And also it's going to have a Boolean property, which is going to be whether that task is done. And then when our task object gets initialized, we need to pass over a name and whether if the property is done. Although by default, pretty much all new tasks are not going to be done, right? Otherwise, why are we creating it? So we're going to give it a default value by adding a equal sign, and we can set that default value to false. So all tasks start out with their is done property set to false. So far, so good. Well, we can also give our task class a method, and this method simply toggles the doneness of the task. So we'll call it toggle done. And in this case, all it needs to do is to look inside the is done property and set it to the opposite of what it currently is. So if this is equal to true, then that exclamation mark is going to set it to the opposite of true, which is going to be false. That's simple enough. And now once we've got our task model, well, we can use it in our task list. And we've already added a list of tasks as the data type, but we need to import that models folder and the task.dart file in order for us to be able to recognize that task object. So now that we've got a list of tasks, and our screen is completely breaking, but let's not worry about that until we've completed our code inside here. And I'm going to create a list of new task objects. So it's just going to be empty for now, and I'm going to go ahead and paste it just 2 more times. And each of these tasks is going to get a name property. So let's say buy milk, and then buy eggs, and buy bread. All right, so there's a whole bunch of foods that's going to be bought. And now we have a list of tasks. But how do we convert this list of tasks into a list of task tiles? Well, currently our task tiles are actually pretty intelligent things. They are stateful widgets because they have all of this functionality that's baked into it. But let's go ahead and make it simpler. I'm going to delete all of these lines of code and I'm going to change it into a stateless widget. And now that we no longer have a stateful widget, then we can't have properties that vary. So that's why I'm getting a little warning over here. So we have to convert this into a final property. And also we can't set state anymore because there is no state to set. So I'm going to go ahead and take out this callback and I'm just going to paste it here for now. And then instead of our task checkbox, I'm actually going to bring my checkbox widget back up and to use it as the widget that's going to be in the trailing part of my list tile. Now, the reason is because now that we have two stateless widgets, it doesn't really make sense to separate out the list tile and the checkbox because both the text widget and the checkbox is going to be rebuilt every time we change the list tile. So it makes sense to keep them together in this case. And besides, we've already used this example to learn all about how we can lift state up and pass callbacks in a simple way that it's easy to see on the same page. So I'm now ready to delete this task checkbox, and I now only have a box standard Flutter checkbox, but still with the same active color and the value and an unchanged. So I'm going to comment out my code that used to be the callback, and I'm also going to comment out the unchanged for now. We're going to come back and address that a little bit later on, but we are going to use the isChecked property as the value of my checkbox. And the isChecked property is going to be initialized when we create a new task tile. So we're going to pass in the this.isChecked, and another one that we want to pass in is the title of the list. We don't want it to always say this is a task, right? So when we create a new list tile, we want to be able to give it a task title to put in here. And that is, of course, going to be another final string property called task title, and it's not going to have a value, similar to the isChecked property. So they're going to be both null to begin with, but then they're going to be initialized when we create this class. So I'm going to add the this.taskTitle in here as well. So now we've converted our task tile to a pretty simple stateless widget, and all it has to do is to rebuild a list tile whenever we update either the isChecked property or the task title property, and that gets passed over when we construct our task tile. So now let's head back over to our task list and add in those arguments that are required here. So the task title will be taken from the task list. So I'll write tasks and I'm going to pull out the first item from my list using the square bracket 0. And then I'm going to tap into the name property of the task object. And I'm going to assign that to the task title of the task tile. The other one that I need to add is the isChecked property. And this is again going to be the 0th item from my tasks. And this is going to be the isDone property. And then I'm simply, for time's sake, going to copy this and paste it in all 3 task tiles. But I'm of course going to update the index for getting hold of the next items in the task. So this task tile is going to display the information from the first or the 0th item from my task list. This one is going to be from the first item, and this one is going to be from the second item. Now, if I go ahead and rerun my app, then you can see that it's carrying over the task names from my task list. But as you can imagine, if we had to add a new task tile to this list of widgets, every single time we wanted to add a new task to our list view, then that's quite a lot of effort and that's quite a lot of computation. So I want to talk about another way of constructing list views in this lesson. namely the ListView Builder. Now, we've already built list views and we kind of know how it works now. But this ListView Builder is really useful when you need to build a large number of children inside the list view, because it's only going to be called for the ones which are actually visible. So it saves resources when you have a really large list. So if we had a to-do list that was infinite, or, say it had 2,000 task tiles inside it, well, then it would actually only use up resources to build the ones that are visible on screen, saving a lot of computation and making our app a lot faster. So how does this ListView Builder work? Well, the only required property in this builder is a indexed widget builder. Well, an indexed widget builder is basically a callback that takes two inputs, the current build context and the index of the current item that's being built. So let me show you how this would work in our case. Here I've got a repetitive bunch of task tiles. And so instead of using all of this code and hurting my fingers through typing all of it, I'm going to go ahead and delete all of that. Instead, I'm going to tap into listview.builder. And then I'm going to pass in a callback into the item builder property. So I'm going to add in my parentheses and my curly braces, as usual with my callbacks. And then inside here, it takes two inputs, the current build context and also the index. The context is going to be a build context. So just as we always have a build context in our build methods, be it a stateful or a stateless widget, this build context basically contains the information that tells the children widget where the parent is in the widget tree. So the task list is inside a container, which is inside an expanded widget, which in turn is inside its own column widget, and then it's in the scaffold, etc. So the information of where that widget lives is in that build context property. And that is what we're going to pass into the list builder to be able to correctly render the child widgets and know where to slot it in the widget tree. Now, the index is the property that we're going to use really shortly. So the first thing that we're going to add to our item builder is we're going to tell it what we want to create. So we're going to return a task tile, and the task tile, of course, takes two named parameters, the task title as well as the isChecked property. So we saw that earlier on when we were building our list view pretty manually. The task title is going to be derived from our tasks list. So I'm going to tap into the task list, and instead of hard coding which one I want to pull out of that list, I'm simply going to pass in the index that comes from this callback. And that matches with the index inside the list view that we're currently building. So if we were building this one right here, then the index passed in would be equal to 0. If we were building this one, then it would be 1, etc. Now, this is not enough because this is actually of type task, and it doesn't match with what task title needs to be, which is string. So then we have to tap into the name property. So pretty similar to what we did before, but in this case, it's now dynamic because we're using that index value that comes from the builder. Now we have a ListView Builder, which is dynamically creating task tiles for every item in our task list. But of course, it can't know how many items we want it to build. So in addition to having this list builder, we can also add another property, which is the item count for our builder. So we can tell it how many of these task tiles we actually want it to build. And of course, we want to build as many task tiles for the number of tasks we have. So I'm simply going to add in tasks dot length to get a dynamic value. So right now it's going to be equal to 3. So the item count for our list view builder is also going to be 3. And that gets rid of our errors down here where it was trying to build something that didn't have a task associated with it. So now we've kind of done exactly the same thing, but in this case, our list view is now completely dynamic, and as soon as we update the state of our task list, then the list view builder is going to rebuild. But it's only going to rebuild the parts that the user can actually see, the parts that are on screen. If we had 1,000 tasks, then we're not going to be using up resources building 1,000 items onto the screen, but instead we're only going to build as many as the user sees. So it's way more efficient. So now we're finally ready to go back into our task tile and figure out how to fix our checkbox, because we've broken that functionality in order to focus on making the dynamic list view builder work. Firstly, we'll need a callback to pass this information when the checkbox gets changed back to the parent. So in this case, the parent would be the parent of the task tile, which is of course the task list, because that's where it's getting created. Here we can again use that callback that we created earlier on, and we can use that inside the onChanged method right here. So we're going to take this method and we're going to bring it back over to our task list. Now I can either do that by creating a named method here, or more easily, and what you'll see more often, is we can simply add it in as an anonymous function. And we're going to pass over that callback when we create the task tile. So over here, I'm going to create a new property that doesn't yet exist, and I'm going to call it the checkbox callback. And inside here, I'm going to paste in that callback that I have from earlier on. So it's going to be triggered inside the task tile where the checkbox is going to pass in the current checkbox state, which is of type Boolean. So this is optional and we can have it or we don't have to. And when we click on one of the checkbox, then this callback is going to get triggered inside the task tile and it's going to pass over the latest value. At which point we're going to update the task at the current index that we're building, and we're going to toggle its doneness. So remember, inside our task model, we had this method called toggle done, which simply changes the isDone property to the opposite of what it used to be. So now we're going to call that with a set state, and hopefully that will trigger a rebuild of the current task tile, and we will get the updated user interface, namely the crossed out text and the checkbox showing up. But of course, currently the checkbox callback property doesn't yet exist. So let's copy it and let's create it inside our task tile. So I'm going to create a final function, which is called checkbox callback. And I'm also going to initialize it when I initialize my task tile. So I can do this in a number of ways. I can either say, when my checkbox gets changed, well, there's going to be a new value that's going to be passed in to this callback. And in that case, I can call the checkbox callback and pass in the new value. But of course, this is kind of redundant in this way, because here we have a callback that takes an input and doesn't return an output. And over here, we have an onChange property, which also tries to trigger a function that takes an input and doesn't have a return value. So we can actually simply just use the checkbox callback inside the property for onChanged. And now if we hit save and I go ahead and check off my items, then you can see that this functionality is working exactly as it did before, but the only change is that we now have a dynamic list view builder, which is ready to build as many items in our list view as we want. Now, in the next lesson, we have a challenge for you. because now that we have this capability of dynamically loading up task tiles, we now want to be able to start adding items into our task list and then updating the state of all the user interface elements so that we can update our app and add the new items below the previous ones. So once you're ready, head over to the next lesson and complete the challenge.